It's been a whole console generation since we last saw Shepard, Tali, Garrus, and the rest of the Normandy crew. Mass Effect Legendary Edition remasters BioWare's space opera RPG trilogy for the new generation of consoles, enhancing the visuals, implementing quality of life improvements, and making welcome adjustments to certain content for all three games. In those adjustments, Legendary Edition occasionally draws unwanted attention to parts of the trilogy that haven't aged gracefully, but as a whole, this remaster is a good way to see what all the fuss is about if you missed out on the first 3 Mass Effect games the first time around, or are just looking for a reason to dive into them again. The core of Mass Effect is its choice and consequence-driven narrative. As Commander Shepard, the first human to be given the role of a Spectre in the interspecies Milky Way government, you are put into many situations where you have the final say on how things go down. Your choices in the first game can influence how characters perceive you, or how events transpire in the second, which then can domino effect into the third. It's up to you to decide whether you wish to be a paragon of virtue, or results-oriented renegade.
You talk too much.
See? The human cannot hit a simple target!
While this consequence-driven system seems to allow a great deal of agency in how you resolve certain conflicts, it's rigid in its design, basing the entirety of Shepard's morality on a binary system of Paragon and Renegade choices. Its simplicity does make the system fairly approachable, reducing the complexity of every decision to a morally good and morally bad choice. Additionally, from an accessibility standpoint, splitting Shepard's choices into a rigid binary helps with better understanding the underlying nuance to certain dialogue choices. But in sticking to this rigid binary, the Mass Effect trilogy strips the tension from certain situations. Mass Effect 2 possesses one of the most egregious examples, where one of the later missions finishes with asking you whether you want to brainwash an entire group of people to think the same way that you do, or simply kill them all. Up to that point, your squad mates provide pros and cons for committing to either option, but the game then regulates the former as the Paragon choice and the latter as Renegade. This undermines the implied tension of the choice. This should be an impossibly difficult decision to make. When it comes down to it, do you think that it is better to deal with those who disagree with you via indoctrination or genocide? But the trilogy's binary choice system removes that nuance, telling the player that, in this instance at least, remaking someone without their knowledge is morally better than killing them. The game reduces all of its conflicts to Paragon versus Renegade. This can make the Mass Effect trilogy feel unrewarding at times. At certain points across all 3 games, special Paragon and Renegade dialogue options will pop up that allow you to resolve the situation and achieve an ideal outcome. But you can only pick these choices if you have enough Paragon or Renegade points, which are earned by picking Paragon or Renegade dialogue options. So to get the best outcomes for certain situations, you need to make a lot of Paragon or Renegade choices, encouraging you to lean one way or the other. It's not very satisfying to see how your choices play out across 3 games if you're being funneled down to one of 2 predetermined paths. But the Mass Effect trilogy's strength has always existed in the story around those choices, not the choices themselves, and Legendary Edition holds true to that. The trilogy's most memorable moments have been preserved. Mass Effect 2's loyalty missions are still some of the best storytelling that BioWare has ever done, and although Mass Effect 1 still doesn't deliver a compelling reason to really romance anyone, its 2 follow-ups better utilize the romance feature, adding replayability as you explore all possible relationships. And on top of that, Legendary Edition's content adjustments and visual enhancements do add new memorable moments for returning fans to enjoy. So even if you've replayed the trilogy a half dozen times, there are still new ways to appreciate the games in this remaster. I love what Legendary Edition does for Eden Prime, Mass Effect 1's opening level for example. In the original game, the sky was blanketed in murky red clouds with lightning flashing. It looked like the end of the world had already occurred and you were coming in on the tail end of an invasion, not during it. In the remaster, Mass Effect 1 now opens on a sunny day, which I find to be far more eerie. This change shifts Mass Effect 1 to better align with the openings of Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3, both of which also begin with an unforeseen, unknowable force interrupting business as usual, mirroring the greater framework of how these games are composed of simple, seemingly everyday decisions being interrupted by brutal consequence.
Gunnery Chief Ashley Williams of the 212. You the one in charge here, sir?
Most of the scenes and character models in Legendary Edition are enhanced with more detailed graphics and improved lighting. This has done wonders for many of the alien characters, especially your squad mates. Some of the human characters, however, aren't as lucky, especially for folks who are darker skinned. In locations where there are a lot of reflective surfaces, the remaster's Mass Effect 1 brightens up their faces in a way that creates blotches of white on their skin, almost like the characters were in the midst of applying shiny paint to their faces when Shepard came along. It's never a great look, though it occurs far less in Legendary Edition's Mass Effect 2, and even less so in Mass Effect 3. And to that end, not all of Legendary Edition's enhancements are good. The increased lighting in some scenes reveals the lack of detail in certain environments. Additionally, the models for some characters lose a bit of their original charm in this remaster. In Legendary Edition, Kelly Chambers' features are muted, for example, subduing the redhead with bright green eyes into a brunette with brownish green eyes. Her new design isn't as unique and doesn't stand out as easily as it did before. But these are all minor complaints. For the most part, the Mass Effect trilogy's original vision has been preserved in this remaster. The exceptions largely exist in Legendary Edition's Mass Effect 1. The most noteworthy is Mass Effect 1's combat, which has been improved to be less temperamental than the original release. Shepard snaps to cover more seamlessly in the remaster, for instance. There are a couple of other small adjustments too, like improved aim assist so it's easier to strafe targets, and a dedicated melee button so you can decide whether to shoot or punch out an enemy rushing your position. The overall effect is that it no longer feels like you're fighting the enemy and the controls in the midst of a firefight. Dying in Legendary Edition's Mass Effect 1 is a far less frustrating affair as a result. When it happens, it's more likely due to a mistake on your part as opposed to the mechanics or controls not playing nice. Granted, there are still issues. Certain biotic and tech abilities can uselessly collide into a wall if your target sidesteps out of your line of sight, as powers don't curve around cover like their Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 counterparts. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough times to be noticeable and annoying, especially in the enclosed spaces found in all the bases you'll uncover across Mass Effect 1's many optional side missions. It's notably still a bit janky, lacking the polished improvements that made Mass Effect 3's combat good enough to warrant the addition of a multiplayer horde mode. The Mako in Legendary Edition's Mass Effect 1 is also a bit janky, lacking the vehicular control seen in Mass Effect 2's Hammerhead, but it thankfully at least handles better than it did in the original game. The explorable planets in Legendary Edition's Mass Effect 1 are still bare of sights to see, and a bit of a slog in the repetitive collectibles and missions, but at least it's now a bit easier to drive on them. Legendary Edition makes a few changes to the trilogy's content too, like adjusting the picture you get of Tally's face in Mass Effect 3 so it doesn't look like a poorly photoshopped stock photo. So even though Legendary Edition isn't a full-blown remake, it goes beyond a traditional remaster, adjusting the very content of the game so that it's an improved experience. But as I mentioned in the intro, the one major downside to these improvements is that it further highlights the original drawbacks of the Mass Effect trilogy that were not changed for the remaster, like the game's poor depiction of mental disabilities and autism. There are small examples like Mass Effect 1's Dr. Warren noting that genius and madness are two sides of the same coin, and larger examples too, such as Mass Effect 2's David Archer, a man who's autistic, being used as a prop, the misunderstood, quote, monster in the Overlord DLC, which is a story that largely focuses on the Dr. Frankenstein-like abuser, Dr. Gavin Archer, instead of the victim. Neither of these instances have been changed in Legendary Edition. They were problematic when these games first released and remain so now. And there are other examples of problematic content across the trilogy, pieces of BioWare's original games that have not aged gracefully years later. As a result, Legendary Edition can feel strange to play through during certain moments. It feels like the remaster only takes a half step toward improvement in certain aspects. Legendary Edition also launches with pretty much all of the trilogy's DLC, but these expansions are implemented in a way that make them more difficult to enjoy for newcomers. For example, Mass Effect 2's The Lair of the Shadow Broker is unlocked as soon as you finish Act 1 of the game, when you're allowed to travel to Ilium for the first time, so you know you have information for Liara before you know it's even possible to meet up with her. You have information to help her track down the Shadow Broker prior to completing errands for her, and learning that she's hit a dead end in her search for the Shadow Broker. Returning players will know to hold off and let the story play out in a way that makes sense, but newcomers can easily just stumble into that DLC without knowing they should do other stuff first. Legendary Edition fails to seamlessly integrate all of its expansions into the trilogy's overall story, which can lead to an annoyingly inconsistent narrative. The remaining changes in Legendary Edition are small, but still worth shouting out. First off, I'm disappointed that the trilogy does not have a truly unified character creator. As Shepard's morality in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 plays a hand in whether they have scars, the option to add scars is only in Mass Effect 1's character creator. It's a bit weird to see my Shepard somehow lose her badass scars in between the events of Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 2. Also, I can understand why, but I'm still sad that Mass Effect 3's multiplayer didn't make the cut. Mass Effect 3's combat is still amazingly solid nearly 10 years later. On the more positive side, Legendary Edition's improved load times are wonderful, removing much of the frustrating waiting and getting lost on the Citadel or dying to the same enemy over and over. Additionally, it's awesome to finally see a default female Shepard across all 3 games. All in all, Mass Effect Legendary Edition isn't this huge transformation for the original trilogy. The remastered Mass Effect 1 is a more enjoyable experience than playing the original game today. It makes for a far more palatable entry point to the series. And Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 look far better than they did before, with minor but welcome changes to specific pieces of content. But otherwise, this remaster delivers the same experience the original trilogy did. In some respects, that's not a wholly good thing. Time has reinforced and made clearer certain underlying issues of the trilogy. But there's a reason the Mass Effect trilogy is beloved by so many. Its strength resides in the wonderful journey that it sends you on, one that's preserved in this remaster.